So how often do you eat per day? 2, 3, 4. If you're like Jordan, maybe 6 times a day. And then you find yourself hungry when you're not eating, when you missed a meal, when you skip lunch, you find yourself getting hungry. And I think one of the things that we recognize is that we all love food, and we begin to get hungry and dissatisfied when we don't have food. We've been in a series called Come to the Table, and it's all about building relationships, welcoming people to the table, and sharing the love of Jesus with people. And we recognize that people are hungry in this society. They're longing for stuff, longing for something that is unmet in their life. This morning, we're going to talk about the story of the feeding of 5,000 that's found in the book of John. Now, the interesting thing about this story is that other than the resurrection, this is the only miracle that appears in all 4 of the Gospels. And so what we discover from this story is how Jesus comes and meets the needs of people. But it's not just about Jesus, but it's about the disciples. More than the 5,000, it's really about the disciples. And to help us understand the story and what Jesus is trying to teach us, we're going to use a little bit from the different Gospels related to that. So Jesus has been doing miracles. And as he's been doing miracles, he's been teaching, and all of a sudden crowds begin to form around him. He's kind of like a celebrity or a circus act, and people are beginning to crowd around him and follow him wherever he goes. And he's by the Sea of Galilee. He's off the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And Mark tells us that he had been teaching for a while. So they've been sitting there listening, and it's getting late in the day, and they're getting hungry. And Jesus is kind of finishing up his teaching, and he notices that people are hungry. Now, what we find out is that Jesus turns to his disciples, and he actually asks Philip a question. He says, hey, where can we go to buy food for them? What was Philip's response? Philip's response was, we don't have enough food, or we don't have enough money to buy this food. And in fact, in Mark, it says that the disciples, their solution to this problem was not that we go buy them stuff, but that they would just go back into the village, and they began to push them away in that process. So how often do we find ourselves maybe in a similar situation where there's a problem, an issue that's presented, like people being hungry, and it might be problems in people's lives of those that we work with or go to school with or in our neighborhood or even in our families. And our solution to helping them is really just go somewhere else. We push them away. The other thing we might do is we might say, hey, we just don't have the resources. We don't know how to do what needs to be done in this situation. We don't have enough money to help you, so go find your solution somewhere else. And so that's what the disciples are doing. They say to Jesus, hey, send them back into town, let them go to Chick-fil-A and find their own food. Well, I put the Chick-fil-A part in there. It's not in the Bible there, but that's what they're doing. And they said to Jesus, you know what, we're tired. We don't have any money. Just send them away. And how often do we miss opportunities when it comes to serving people in relationship because we're too tired or we're too busy or we find it too inconvenient to reach out and help people? We might say we're not talented enough. We don't have enough experience or enough knowledge. And so we say, Jesus, send them away, send them to someone else. We can't help them. But notice what Jesus does. So at this point, I want you to put yourself into the story. I want you to be one of the disciples. I'm going to be one of the disciples. And Jordan later will be Jesus, and you'll see why in just a little bit. So Jesus instead says to the disciples, hey, I don't want you to send them away. I want you to feed them. And you might be, as a disciple, we might be looking at each other going, you've got to be kidding. There's 5,000 men, probably between 10,000 and 20,000 people altogether, and you want us to feed everybody? You've got to be crazy. Is he serious? Is he really serious about this? We don't even have enough for ourselves. And Mark records that Jesus asks an important question. Now, this question is something that I believe God is asking each one of us. Jesus says, go and see what you have. Take inventory of what you have and let me know what you have. Now, oftentimes we might interpret that as Jesus saying, hey, go find out what you don't have And that's pretty easy. Hey, we don't have this, we don't have that, we don't have... No, Jesus is not asking that question. He's asking the question, what do you have? And so the disciples are probably looking at each other going, is this real? Is this really happening? You mean, Jesus, you want me to go and ask these people, maybe I went to high school with some of them, go and ask them, what do they have to share? And is he serious about that? And so they might be thinking, well, maybe Jesus is looking for something little, just as an illustration, like a prop for his teaching. And so they go out and they begin to look for food, and they find a young boy with his lunch, 5 loaves and a couple fish. Hey, they probably tell the boy, can we borrow your food? Can we borrow your loaves and your fish? We'll bring them right back. Jesus is just going to use them as a prop, and we'll bring them right back. And so Jesus is there, and the disciples come and they bring the food to Jesus. And Andrew says to Jesus, this is, I think, the humorous part in the whole story. Andrew says, hey, we found this kid's Lunchables, 5 barley loaves and a couple of fish. And what do you think Jesus said? Oh, no, that's not going to do. Go out and find more. No, that's not what he does. And so he comes, so he says, give them to me. So the disciples take 5 loaves and they give them to Jesus. There's Jesus. Hey, Jesus, there's your 5 loaves. And this is what he says to them. He says, go and get everybody to sit down. Now that sounds like an odd question for them to do, or odd command for them to do. But Jesus says, go and have them sit down. So he stretches them. They're going out and they're telling people to sit down. It's probably like going and telling 5-year-olds to go and sit down in a circle. And they're saying, well, why do we need to sit down? Who are you to tell me to sit down? But eventually they get everybody to sit down. And what happens is Jesus takes some bread and he gives thanks, and he begins to break the bread into pieces. And this is exactly what he does in the upper room. We know the whole story of John, but that's what he does in the upper room. And he breaks the bread, and then this is the point. He gives some to the disciples. And the disciples are beginning to look, and they're saying, okay, what do I do with this? I mean, it's not very much, and look at the crowd. They have to come to a decision, and it's kind of a decision that we all have to come to. What are we going to do with the little that Jesus has given us? Do we keep it and just hang out with Jesus? Jesus, can I just hang out with you more? Or do I go out and do I serve with what little I have? And so the disciples go and they begin to give out that bread, and they give it to the first group. And they come back to Jesus, and lo and behold, Jesus has more. And so they go out and they give to the next group. And they come back with nothing, and they turn around and they see that Jesus has more. And then they go and they give that away to the third group. And then they come back and they're like, okay, he's got to be done, right? But he has more. And more. And more. Woo! And they go and they give it back. And he continues to this process with his disciples, giving more and giving more. And this goes on until everyone, as John says, everyone was full. And we discover that there's more than just meeting the need. There's even more than just feeding those 5,000 left over. And I wonder if that's exactly what Jesus is waiting for the disciples to do in this moment. Just trust him. And recognize that Jesus is not asking for everything. He's asking for your little. He's asking for what you can offer to a friend that you've been building a relationship with. He's asking, what can you give to serve others? And we might think, oh, that's not very much. I don't have very much. But the lesson of the story of the feeding of 5,000 is that Jesus takes the little and he turns it into much. And in fact, later in John chapter 6, Jesus is talking to his followers, these people that have gathered around him, and he says to them that I am the bread of life. He says to them, I am the one who satisfies your longing. I'm the one that will give you everything you need and satisfy that hunger. Jesus is the one who takes the little and makes it more than enough, that makes it plenty and satisfies. And so what we learn is that Jesus is inviting us not to run away from problems, not to run away from our friends who have problems, but to face those problems with our friends, to build relationships with them with our limited abilities, our limited knowledge, our limited resources, because he can take that limited and turn it into plenty. And he invites us to let them know the bread of life. May God lead us to inviting people to the table where we share our little so that they can encounter the bread of life and find satisfaction for their hunger, whatever that hunger is in their life.